Yeah, I'm ready. Let's go to it.
Great. Samir, thank you very much for your time this afternoon. So we're doing a podcast called Tonal Confluence, and the idea is to look at different types of kind of melodically innovative musical styles like raga and maqam, raga both in its Hindustani and Carnatic forms, and how it confluences with jazz, or has across over the past maybe 6 or 7 decades. And as one of the leading musicians today, in my view, attempting to do that, we would really value hearing about your story, your perspectives on how these kind of different thought processes come together.
Well, I really, really appreciate that. You're very kind. It's an honor to be considered someone who is representing that movement. You know, I agree. I think that it's there has been a really amazing exchange of musical ideas and sort of development on both sides. You know, with the exposure of like one side's influences to the other, and I think it's really a fascinating subject. So I think it's a really great thing for you all to explore. I'm happy to be part of the discussion. For me personally, you know, I grew up, I was born in the States, and I grew up with the, you know, the American school system. So exposure to Indian traditional culture, other than what came from my own family, which was not really a musical family. My father is an engineer, and he immigrated here, you know, in his 20s. And my mom, they got married in India, came back here, you know, so like, I think it's, I had a very typical sort of first generation born experience. But, you know, with my brother, who is 3 years older than me, and he really turned me on to some great music, which I think a lot of older siblings do. And so, you know, I really got exposed to some of the best, what I think was some of the best music, Led Zeppelin, Jimi Hendrix, you know, and then going into sort of the era of rock, where there was a little bit more like Afro punk going on, like Living Colour, and you know, just like Bad Brains, and kind of like really embracing the African American roots of music, right? Black American music,
right?
And to me, that has always been something that's just like, you know, I feel like I could hear it. You know, you could hear how the rhythm sections played and how they had a certain kind of pocket, and how they would swing, you know, almost like even playing really hard hitting rock stuff. And so I just love the sound of that energy. And I think it really drew me to jazz music. And so I got very into jazz music in my high school days, and kind of was going with orchestral percussion until then, a lot of Western classical, European classical influence stuff. And then jazz, and got into improvisational music. And was really just turned on by that world, you know, the way that form and structure and melody and rhythm were just really a wide open field. And in the case of jazz music, I think a touch of irreverence is very much like embraced, you know. I think that it's like this idea that when the powers that be say that you can only do things a certain way, you'll find a jazz musician who says, watch me do it this other way, you know, and I'm going to take this risk, or I'm going to push back and say no when everyone else is saying, you know, yes to this one thing. I'm going to show you the other thing. I'm going to, like Sun Ra, like I'm going to show you the unknown, you know, and that attitude really expands the horizons of the music in a way that's very profound. And I think it opens it up to music of India, music of, you know, the Middle East, and music of all kinds of places of the world. When I think about sort of like the cross-cultural exchange, sometimes it's very interesting for me to see it in parallel with immigration. You know, like I think about how, you know, maybe 50 years ago, there was an early exposure to India, right? And maybe it was a little superficial, and you got some of the very surface level things about it. but it was enough to draw your interest, but it was still very much orientalized and other, and right? And I feel like from that, there's like a musical moment there with like Ravi Shankar and Yehu, right?
Right.
Which you can see the impulse like for creativity. Like there's so much mutual respect, but they're so worlds apart, you know, like their idea of intonation is not totally together. Their idea of how to rhythmically sit on the beat is not entirely at the same place. And so that quality is there. And then you have sort of the following generation, which is almost like Zakir Hussain, you could say. Like, and Zakir Hussain, of course, just right next to Ravi Shankar in generation, right? Like just one generation next. And Zakir Hussain actually grew up going to a lot of these different parts of the world, right? So it was like a lot more of a love and appreciation, but not quite so distant, right? It was like he could go and collaborate with Cuban musicians in person and learn their traditions in person. And I think that the product of that, you know, is probably Shakti, be considered one of the achievements of that generation. And I think that it was really powerful to see the community around that music making, from like El Shankar to Bikuvan, you know, and you know, just, and then how it is today, where it's like, you know, coming back and it has all these new faces, but the energy is still kind of there, you know. But that original chemistry with those musicians is so phenomenal, you know. And John McLaughlin's, you know, will and fire, like to get in there and get it, you know. It was like, that's the kind of virtuosity and dedication that's needed to appreciate Indian classical music, right? So
yeah, absolutely. And you already started answering my first and second questions. And you know, I think, you know, if you look at the melding of rag sangeet and jazz, you can come at it from either the rhythmic angle, you know, very much. I'm going back to Mahavishnu Orchestra or Shakti, where you take some of the Carnatic or maybe Hindustani rhythms, and or you can come at it from the tonal side, where you know, hear some of the collaborations between, say, McCoy Tyner and Bella Fleck, maybe McCoy's influence playing with John Coltrane, or and I really see kind of a nice fusion of both of those approaches in your work. I mean, two songs specifically come to my mind. So Puriya Harlem Dhanashri is brilliant to me, because it takes, you know, a Vakra raga, right, something that has a twisted pattern, and puts it in a polyrhythmic setting. And on the same on the same album, perhaps, correct me if I'm wrong, you have a recreation of Blue and Green, which tries to take this chromatic thinking that Bill Evans has. And in many ways, you know, Raga Sangeet moves away so much from the Western tonal sense that you're trying to approach it that way. So just explain your thinking. Was it conscious that you're going to approach this melding of raga and jazz both from a polyrhythmic standpoint and a tonal chromatic standpoint?
Wow, it's a great question. And I love that you just like called out my own discography at me, because what record, because there's a couple of times that I've done that Puriya Dhanashri sort of, you know, sort of influenced, you know, different kinds of arrangements. Okay, so both of those are from my album Namaskar. Okay, so both of those tracks you called out, Puriya Harlem Dhanashri has Pandit Ramesh Mishra on it, on Sarangi. And so that piece particularly was, it took shape in a very, very unique way. And in a way, like I kind of knew what I wanted to do before I got in there, right? So one thing that I've come to understand a lot of times is like the mood around a raga, right? When you are sort of calling on the persona of a raga or the sentiment or that, this is like, it's like the biggest respect you can give in Indian classical music. You know what I mean? When we take off our shoes, when we sit down, when we do puja before these concerts, this is all like in reverence to this raga, right? And when I was sitting with Ramesh Ji, I was like, I want him to just go to that place, and I want to play along with that, but I don't want him to get disrupted in his creation of that space, right? So like for me to throw all kinds of polyrhythms and all kinds of like drum set related phrasing on top of it was more than likely gonna derail his attempt to create a certain picture, right? So for me, I basically was like, Ramesh Ji, I want you to just, put on your headphones. I'm going to turn off the drum set. You're not going to hear the drum set at all. And I want you to just play alam, right? And don't worry about any thalam. Don't worry about anything. And then I listened to him and I played along with him, but we didn't agree on a lay or a pulse or a thala or anything, right? So for me, it became a study more in phrasing and learning how to phrase with the phrase itself having a rhythmic integrity, right? Where like a phrase can kind of exist outside of a rhythmic cycle, but it still needs to have a phrase. Like, it still has a rhythm. And so that to me is a very sort of abstract place to meet musically, right? Because typically like me and a raga musician would say, okay, we're both in 7-beat rupak tala, and this is the raga, and this is the bandish, and we're going to know where the sum is and drive a lot of our creativity. In this case, it was more, Ramesh was being creative in an alap space without thinking alap. And I was being very creative in a rhythm space, right? Without worrying about any bandish or any thought. So it was a very sort of, to me, the sound that's captured there is totally like unique picture. There's a chaos there, but there's a peacefulness there. It has all these kinds of intersections happening. And so I think the polyrhythms that are there, it's purely just me, like kind of there, and Ramesh Ji's like in there, and I'm definitely keeping an ear for like where is he going regarding his sur, and but I'm also not trying to we're not trying to drive each other towards any goals, right? It's very much just like a meeting, like a confluence.
Right. And some thoughts on blue and green, because I always think of the chromatic chords or of Bill Evans, and if you look at certain Indian ragas like Bhairav in Hindustani, it's very different than the Western tonal or I should say Western diatonic scale of major and minor. It doesn't fit neatly into either. So what was your thinking in kind of selecting that piece, and how did you approach that song? Of course, rhythmically, it's very different than the original Blue and Green.
The rhythm of it is actually the more of the thing that I thought was giving it an interesting point. It was giving it an interesting shape, right? That sort of chal, as they, and so it's almost like it has like a bit of a clave, right? And that to me is a very interesting thing to see how the chords of Blue and Green can move in a way that are still very spacious and open and very like you're saying, like it's like these colors that come up and then they change to a new color, and those chromatic movements are very beautiful, and it's actually very calm and peaceful, even though it isn't, and the chords are moving. But to me, it was more about saying, let's keep those chords, let's keep those like movements, harmonic chord movements, but let's show how the rhythms inside that, micro beats inside each of those are very much like up for interpretation. You could fit 7, you could fit 9. So that approach to, a lot of times jazz musicians, they think in macro. So they'll group 7 quarter notes or 7/8 notes and make it into 7. But in Indian classical music, they'll go more micro. And so they'll fit 7 beats inside of 1 beat. So that sort of point of departure in how you approach either like dissecting a beat or like constructing out of a beat, So I find that very fascinating. To me, Blue and Green, I wanted that to be a bit of a study in that, where like the chords stay in a place where a jazz musician could typically be like, oh yeah, this is in I know where this is, but what is going on in each beat here? Like, you know, something's a little bit different, right? But then something is very much easy too, right? So like, its simplicity is kind of the real treasure there, right? Like Blue and Green is a very simple song. Like you don't have to be a jazz musician to love that song, you know? And so like it's really important to preserve that, right? Like that whole album Kind of Blue, like that album speaks to so many people. You know, Miles Davis is Kind of Blue. So it's like it doesn't need to be a big deal to like connect to people. So to preserve that sort of easiness and that sort of reaching across the aisle and saying, hey, like you can come this way. We got you, you know, we're going to meet you more than halfway. We're going to play your song, but then we're going to, you know, show you a little bit of how Indian music can kind of breathe inside of there. That's a lot of my approach. It's like, you know, I don't try and come too hard from one side. I don't try and serve necessarily a jazz musician's purpose of exercising their like limitless creativity. And I don't necessarily serve the Indian classical musician's desire to serve limitless creativity. It's more just like, what are some of the songs that this side values and cherishes and is part of the canon? And the reason why it's part of the canon is sometimes these very simple, essential things, right? Like Rag is like all about, it's all about these essentials that you sort of, you know, you hold on to. And the more you exist with these essentials, the more you blossom, the more things blossom out of that, right? So how do you preserve that feeling? And so like, to me, that's been very exciting to share with jazz musicians to say, let's slow down, right? Let's like take your 1,000 ideas and make it 10 ideas. And now suddenly working in these 10 ideas, you have a lot of potential for new ideas, right? And it still stays very grounded in these essential things. To me, that's like connecting with rock.
Yeah, true. I mean, one maybe overtly simplistic way of, at least the way I look at Rag Sangeet is how can you exercise maximum creativity within a set of rules? And then jazz is, okay, you have, I mean, especially if you take kind of the Ornette Coleman definition of, of very abstract jazz, then okay, you have almost no rules, and how can you make something interesting without it being cacophonic, right? Like how can you you have a blank sheet of paper, and how do you create of course that's, you know, one definition of jazz. There are many.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, as a jazz musician, I have to confess, like some of the most cacophonous stuff I've heard is a bunch like raga musicians playing jhala at the end of a raga, right?
Oh,
like,
yeah.
Like it borders on the most out jazz I've ever heard, right? Where I'm almost like, I think I need to leave. Like, like this has become purely like an energy thing, which actually I really like then. Like if I give myself over to that, right? Forget about rag, forget about tal, think energy, right? That to me then gets to where Ornette Coleman, late John Coltrane, some of the most avant-garde music is tapping into like a visceral humanity, you know, that is like it's more about vibration and energy, and it's not about those conventional rules that you've been playing with for 90% of the piece. You know what I mean? It's like this the raga piece. It's like you've been in this, you know, alap, slow vilambit, drut, bandish after bandish for an hour and a half, and then at the end, it's like now we need to push to this like ecstatic bliss place, right? And it's and it doesn't just happen in speed, like it happens even in like gamaka, like the idea of going like, nah, like to someone who doesn't appreciate what's happening there, it's like, that's really out there, you know? Like I'll listen to some Kishori Omankar and I'll be like, my gosh, this is like it's so out. Like she's the tone she's getting, the timbre, it's like this whistling, it's so in tune and it's activating all these frequencies, but it's like, you know, it's like something else. It's like outer than the outest jazz to me at times, because it's like it's almost working in a purely vibrational space.
No, I think you make a great point in terms of how a piece of music makes you feel viscerally. You made that point about preserving that approachable nature of Blue and Green, and then this kind of visceral feelings that a certain piece of music arouses. So technicality is interesting, but I think at the end of the day, what is the overall feel, or rasa, as we would say in
I
Rag
think
Sangeet?
totally true. Like when I hear Shahid Parvez, for example,
Mhm.
you know, like his polyrhythms are so advanced, you know, where you're hearing a slow 16 beat teen dal and he's overlaying some like 13 beat phrase on top of
Mhm.
it, you know, and it's taking so long to resolve, right? And for an Indian classical musician, you know, this is like can be beautiful and it's like so amazing and so gorgeous. And I think for somebody else that could just be like, I have nothing to hold on to here. Like I'm floating in space and it's very uncomfortable, right? And then you put that same person into in a jazz concert with Rashid Ali or something and Coltrane, and they'll be like, wow, this is amazing. Like I get this, right? And so much of it is like the listener themselves, right? And what is their
Mhm.
scope of understanding? And honestly, like to me, like the chromaticism and cacophony and the very, very sort of I don't even know what the word is. It's just it's like it's the speed at which Indian classical musicians play jhala, instrumentalists particularly, people like Shahid Parvez,
Mhm.
even Aditya Ranade, and
Mhm.
you know, there's Hariji, for example, Shiv Kumar Sharma. These, you know, it is like it's like pushing something, you know, so hard that it's gonna break. You wonder if it's gonna break. And then it just that kind of doesn't break. And you're like, my God, like this is still music. This is still music. They pushed it way past what you thought was, you know, limits. You know, they took you way past the limits you thought were there. To me, that's John Coltrane. That's late Coltrane. You know.
Certainly, certainly. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit and ask you about Brooklyn Raga Massive, of which you're a co-founder.
Yeah.
Uh,
My daughter is just waking up too. So
yeah. Hi. That's Avni. She's saying hi. So tell us a little bit about, because I think Brooklyn Raga Massive is doing something very, very interesting on multiple levels. You're bringing in Makam musicians, which is probably a topic for another day. I'm talking to some folks about right, the similarities and differences between those two traditions, and then you have folks like, you know, Brian Shankar Adler, who's also doing something very interesting in terms of sometimes preserving the integrity of the raga, sometimes kind of taking it more into psychedelic rock space, sometimes doing mridangam. So tell us about, how did you come up with this idea, and where do you see Brooklyn Raga Massive going in the coming years?
that's a great question. So I definitely can't take credit for the idea. The idea of it was, I think, originally just to bring musicians together, right, and to have us be in a shared space where we see each other, we acknowledge each other, and we, you know, I think, and then from there, you know, it can go in so many places, right? Like, and I think like a lot of groups of artists, the beginning stages have started it a certain way, and then it's grown to go into a different thing that maybe some people are on, some people are not into it. Maybe they're going to come back and loop back in, you know? So I've always been of the mindset where, you know, if there is a value that can be found in being together as a community of Indian classical musicians, that's the most important thing that can happen. And to be able to preserve that sense of connection in a community, right? Like those are to me, those are very artist-centric goals, right? So it's very much like, to me, Raga Massive was always about an artist-centered approach and trying for musicians themselves to do their thing, right? And to become vehicles in their own industry, and to be able to define their own terms, and to be able to find a sense of power in community, right? Classical music to me is one of those places where more often than not, you see a lot of division, right? Either based on Gharana or Guru or status, you know? And so I think that to me, that was a place that this was really needed, right? It was really needed to be able to say, it doesn't matter, you know, who you are. It doesn't matter who your guru is. It doesn't matter what your last gig was. If if you come into this space, like, and you have a good attitude and you're a good person and you vibe well with people, then like you're going to be welcome, right? And this space can offer you things and you can offer things to this space, right? But it's like, it's sort of a very, I think, just like come as you are type of attitude, you know? And so I think that's why you'll see a lot of great traditional Indian classical musicians who get very excited about getting involved, right? And playing and meeting people. But then you also find people who are curious about Indian classical music come in through the door, and they're just great musicians who've studied from different styles, you know? And they get turned on to it and they want to know more about it, and they help push the community to have a certain kind of musical confluence that wasn't maybe there, you know? Someone like Brian Adler is a great example. Like his musical tastes are very different than mine, even though we're both percussionists, right? And so that is the kind of space where we want to be able to both see each other, and actually not just see each other, but like kind of build together. Like we don't have to work together, but like this is our community, right? Even in India, like, you know, if Brian goes to India and I connect him with someone that I know in India, that is a big part of what that community is about, right? And that happens. That happens. Sometimes it happens casually. Sometimes it happens in a very deliberate way, right? But to me, there seems to always be a need to keep that in a very humble place and in a very community-centered place and in a very like, you know, like just like you can't get too big with that vision, right? Because like I mean, just music in general is full of this idea of like gatekeepers. You know, musicians put festivals on, musicians end up being the people who will give gigs to other people, and ends up being sometimes transactional, and that doesn't feel good for some people, right? So many qualities about the industry that can be improved upon, right? And I think that there's a tendency for it always to go in a very commercialized, maybe capitalist way. I think that it's really good to just keep the community-centered goals to be out of that realm, right? Because like there's always going to be those young musicians, there's going to be people who just are trying to get their foot in the door and they maybe don't have a lot of connections, you know? And it shouldn't be that they need to go through a bunch of hoops or somehow, you know, get in the good graces of specific people in order to get the opportunities to build and grow and get to the top tier, right? And in New York City, in the jazz scene, I firmly believe that the jam session is the place where that happens, right? Where you don't need to be coming and wearing a suit. You don't have to be a big shot. If you come in and know how to play and you can connect with people, that's what's going to get people to notice, right?
Yeah.
And I think what Raga Massive was trying to do, it's really just be like, let's gather, let's play music, let's have this be about music. This is not about kurtas, it's not about, it's not about, you know, and we'll put on whatever music we want, we'll have a beer, we'll get into arguments about, you know, how great Bode Ghulam Ali Khan Sahab is, you know, and it's like, us, right? Like you just gotta go for it.
And I find that so refreshing. You know, you talked about kind of the irreverence of jazz early on, which I'm a trained Hindustani vocalist, but I get, you know, sometimes the reverence gets a little bit too much for me. Maybe I've become too American over the years. But with this Raga Massive, it sounds like you've almost brought the music of Raga and Makam, combine that with the ethos of the late 40s and early 50s New York jazz scene, where Miles Davis could go and play with, you know, Bird and Gillespie on one hand, and then hang out with Monk on the other hand, while being much younger than any of those folks. So I know, and I think the fact that it's in Brooklyn, right? I think it's kind of a nice nice add-on to that history.
There definitely is a certain vibe that happens at the jam session, you know, where you're like, oh my gosh, look who just walked in the door. You know, I remember that in the early days, like Pandit Vishwa Mohan Bhatt came in, you know, he just walked into this bar. He's wearing like his gold kurta, like just regal, you know? And I was just like, wow, this is really something. Like, you know, no one knew who he was. Like, you know, I mean, we knew who he was, but like
Right.
everyone there was just like, okay, whatever, like big deal, you know. So that sort of has this kind of like cool part to it where I think about, my gosh, like these are the times, you know, where like someone who's like really a tier one artist, you know, who's known in the industry, can just be playing, you know, at a place you can just hear someone who's a local Indian classical musician who's really good and is not there for any purpose other than just to play music. They didn't know Pandit Vishnu Mohan Bhatt was going to walk in the room, you know what I mean?
Right. So it's very egalitarian, which is refreshing. So I realize that we're a little bit past of our kind of allotted half hour, Samir. But I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you this last question. And a very interesting experiment that you're doing in something I've just learned about today: the words of our ancestors, where you're taking spoken word from folks as different as Jiddu Krishnamurti to James Baldwin to Muhammad Ali to Angela Davis, and tried to meld that with different ragas, days for Jiddu Krishnamurti and Nayaki Kannada for Muhammad Ali. So tell us how that idea came about, and what are you trying to do?
That's a good question. I don't really always know what I'm trying to do. But I think that there was definitely, this has been something that I've been interested in for a while. And I guess there's a couple of terms that have come up in music circles, where basically there's a process of sampling that actually doesn't really, like there's a lot of like post-production on the sampling. And so it's not really recognizable as the original sample, right? And so it's a different approach. It's almost more like using it as an instrument, using sampling as an instrument. So I was trying to really approach ragas with this. And so I was thinking to myself, okay, I have this Ram Narayan LP, and it's in rag, Shankara or something. And then I have some old recording, of a sarod player doing Shankara. And so then I go and I pitch shift both of those alaps, right? Because I don't want to have any rhythmic cycles happening. And I'll pitch shift those and even time shift those to be the length of time of a speech by Angela Davis, a speech that I love to listen to, Martin Luther King's speech or someone's speech, right? I mean, this is the stuff I love. I like listening to civil rights speakers, and that fires me up just as much as raga music, So I was like listening to these ragas over and over again and getting so much. And I was listening to these speeches so much, getting so much. And I was like, I really could listen to either one of these forever. I want to put them together. And one listen, my ear will go to the speech, and then another listen, it'll go to the raga, right? And so I was trying to create a sort of backdrop of raga, but something that was really not just an obvious musician playing in the front. It was much more of like a painting that's put in the background. And then having a speech by, a civil rights leader that I really, am impassioned by, that just runs straight down. You hear the whole speech in its entirety. And and it took me some time to find ones I like. I mean, the Isaac Asimov one I really like, which is like about the age of irrationality. And Krishnamurti's one I really, really like as well, And so I just, I come back to those recordings and I'm like, I really just like listening to this. There's no other way for me to put it. I like listening to it. And I feel like there's times when I'm just like, my God, it's beautiful. Like this Muhammad Ali with Nayaki Kannada by Buddhadev Das Gupta. It's just like, it works. And sometimes when I hear that kind of thing, I'm like, you know what? It works. And that can't be fought. You can't really deny that. It's like it has some sort of impact on both sides. And something incidentally, which are beautiful moments, which are just gorgeous, So once I start seeing those things happen and I see how well it goes together, then I'm just compelled to like continue to explore and see the whole skeleton of the dinosaur, whatever it is that I'm discovering at that time.
No, absolutely. And I just thought it was a confluence of another sort of spoken word and raga sangeet, and from very, very different cultures, and pushing both raga sangeet and jazz in different directions. I was almost reminded of Roy Hargrove doing some interesting things with spoken word and recorded pieces of music, you know, a few years ago.
Oh my gosh, Roy Hargrove, another legend, you know, just, that's great. This has been a really great conversation today. We've covered the greats. I don't even know how many legends' names have come up on this report.
No, so I really, really appreciate your time, Samir. And you know, if we decide to put this up, of course, you know, we'll share, and we'll share the recording with you and get your feedback, suggestions. But if we do a podcast, this would be our opening. This would be your opening act, and you know, many congratulations to everything you have achieved and the boundaries you continue to push.
Thank you so much.
And look forward to keeping in touch.
Let's do that for sure. Take care.